Midterm Proc. Question 1. To what extent do you disagree with the characterization of populism as a contested concept? Be sure to discuss the ways in which populism has been defined and studied in your answer. Definitions. Mud on populism. Mud, 2004, argues that populism largely revolves around two sets of actors, the pure people and the corrupt elite. Populism is an ideology that believes politics should be the general will of the people. It is divided into two opposites: elitism, which supports a vision of politics rooted in the elite, and pluralism, which rejects homogeneity and views politics as a process of different groups with varying interests. Populists use the term people to signify their commitment to a specific interpretation of reality. It is often used to signify three key ideas: the people as sovereign, the people as common people, and the people as the nation. The conception of a people differs depending on the ideological orientation of populism, left-right. Populism is a thin-centered ideology that does not fit neatly along a left-right spectrum but can be adopted to do so, similar to Laclau. Populism is a political ideology that focuses on the people and the elite as the key source of conflict in society. It is moralistic rather than programmatic and is motivated by outlining what they are against with more uncertainty and variability. In liberal democracies, populists tend to adopt an anti-political party stance due to parties being the main representatives of the people. They are more reformist than revolutionary and aim to create a new party system rather than overthrowing the system in its entirety. Populists are emancipatory and revolutionary in their aims, but do not aim to change the overall ideology or common sense of the people. They believe that the common sense of ordinary people should dictate the political sphere. Key takeaways. Cont. Populism is an illiberal democratic response to undemocratic liberalism, which is defined as popular sovereignty and majority rule combined with minority rights, rule of law, and separation of powers. It is democratic in its support for popular sovereignty and majority rule, but illiberal in disregarding minority rights, rule of law, and separation of powers. Undemocratic liberalism is the current neoliberal system of economics and government, where political power is increasingly delegated to economic arenas and international organizations. This has led to a weakening of the power of voters in the process of establishing laws and having a say in the ways they are implemented. Three different definitions of undemocratic liberalism are Laclau, Mudd, and Muller. Thin-centered ideology. Laclau. Laclau's populism consists of three key elements: the articulation of a heterogeneous set of demands into a chain of equivalence, an empty signifier representing this chain, and an antagonistic dividing line between people on one side and those who would prevent them from fulfilling their demands on the other. Multiclass movements claim rights for the common people, highlighting authoritarianism and charismatic leadership. They don't fit into conventional political ideologies such as left v right or populism, but rather multiclass movements that claim rights for the common people. Mudd. Populism is an ideology that views the elite as a single homogeneous corrupt group who are working against the general will of the people for self-serving reasons. It draws on the notion of a general will to critique representative democracy, advocating for direct democracy such as plebiscites and referenda. Populists in liberal democracies tend to adopt an anti-political party stance, arguing that parties corrupt the link between political leaders and their supporters, divide the population for political gain, and serve their own interests at the expense of the people. They aim to empower the population to become aware of the exploitation they face at the hands of society's elites so that they may then be better equipped to supplant them as the major source of authority and governance. Politics represent the general will of the people, with the people as sovereign common people and nation. Nebulous definitions of populism. Populism is a contested concept whose definition is contested due to actors not typically identifying themselves as populists. Its meaning and varieties are context-dependent, but some conceptualizations are more influential than others. Muller. Populism and pluralism are antithetical, as populism is a form of identity politics and is exclusionary due to its categorization of individuals as either good or evil. Similarities. Laclau says doesn't fit with the right-left dichotomy. Mudd. The elite versus people. Muller says that it is an anti-establishment and an exclusionary practice due the categorizations. Methods of populist mobilization. For example, personalist leadership. Social movements. Political parties. There are generally three mechanisms through which populist actors have tended to mobilize support. Mudd and Kaltwasser 2017. Personalist leadership. Social movements. Political parties. 1. The most common tactic of mobilization is using a charismatic leader who claims to be the representative of the people and personification of the general will. This tactic is characterized by a top-down strategy in which leaders gain support through their personal appeal and engagement with supporters. 2. Social movements provide an important opportunity for populist actors to succeed due to their tendency to divide society into supporters-opposers of the movement. Examples of such movements include the global Occupy movements and the anti-austerity movements in Europe during the 2008 financial crisis. 3. Populism can operate through the political party system by challenging other parties on key issues or trying to force party system change. The rising levels of support for populist parties over time demonstrate the demand for expanding the representativeness of the party families within the electoral sphere. However, the electoral systems adopted in different contexts have important implications for the extent to which challenger parties such as populist parties can exercise influence on the system. Difficulties with studying populism. For example, context dependence, transportability of Western concepts. Methods through which populism has been studied. For example, strategy, ideology, discourse, performance. Populism as ideology. This approach to studying populism focuses on the content of leaders' ideologies, rather than their strategies of gaining support. Mudd argued that these ideas revolve around the notions of a corrupt elite and a pure people, which can be molded to fit any ideological bend. This version of studying populism aims to focus on the moralistic vision of society that populists craft and how it is used to separate people into good and evil camps. Studies of populism draw on textual sources of data such as election and party manifestos and political speeches to examine the extent to which populist messaging unfolds along the elite people axis. This approach also focuses on party systems and the changing dynamics around electoral coalitions. Once parties are classified as populist or non-populist, these studies look closely at the constituencies who support them, the leadership styles adopted by party leaders, and the ways in which populists govern once elected. Populism as discourse. This approach to the study of populism understands it as a discursive style of politics that is rooted in the elite-people dichotomy. It focuses on the use of language in persuading large numbers of people to support a populist cause, rather than on the individual actor. The focus is on the message being conveyed rather than on the individual actor. This approach to the study of populism focuses on the variations in the usage of populist messaging by different individuals and on understanding the style of their argument. It can provide a scale on which to measure populism, which can include all types of parties. Studies of the U.S. Bonikowski and Gidron 2016 have found that political candidates of both parties have been more likely to utilize populist discourse in their speeches during the latter half of the 20th century relative to previous eras. Norris GPS as example of measuring populism globally. Global Party Survey, GPS, Norris 2020. The GPS provides an innovative way of measuring populism internationally by charting the development of ideological values and issue positions of different types of political parties globally. The study relies on a rhetorical understanding of populism to make it more generalizable to a diverse set of cases. The dataset adopts a definition of populism as a rhetoric which espouses that legitimate authority comes only from the will of the people who are defined in relation to their enemy, the political establishment. Question 2. Evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the major hypotheses that have been put forward to explain the rise of populism in the contemporary era. Which of these hypotheses do you find most least convincing? Post-industrial transformation of society hypothesis. Populist parties have become prominent since the 1980s due to post-industrial societies altering the relationship between social democracy and mainstream political parties. This has caused rising levels of dissatisfaction with mainstream parties, leading to the emergence of smaller parties such as populist parties to represent increasingly disaffected voting blocs. Examples of major alliances include working-class voters and social democratic parties and wealthier religious voters and conservative parties. The post-industrial transformation hypothesis focuses on the ways in which a rising standard of living and education rates among the populations of Western economies in the post-war era has led to the fracturing of mainstream party rule. This process has been facilitated by both voters and party agendas, leading to new electoral cleavages that go beyond those that characterized the political sphere prior to the 1980s and require new representation. Rejection of catch-all parties has also been seen. Ronald Inglerhertz, 1971. Post-materialist thesis states that the electorates of Western countries have become increasingly mobilized by post-material concerns relative to historically dominant material concerns. This change can be attributed to increasing levels of education and material security among younger cohorts, who have replaced older voters as the key voting blocs in advanced industrialized democracies following the Second World War. As a result, older voters are more representative of traditional values and tend to vote along materialist lines, whereas younger generations are more representative of progressive values and vote along post-material lines. The key characteristic of this transformation among both political parties and voters has been the rising levels of saliency and mobilization away from first-dimension issue orientations and towards second-dimension orientations. First-dimension issues relate to economic issues such as labor market participation, wages, income and wealth redistribution, and welfare state benefits, while second-dimension issues relate to a broader range of issues such as environmental protection, human rights, gender equality, and immigration and multiculturalism. These issues have become increasingly important in the post-1980s-90s. Gingrich and Hoare's Sermon 2015. Hawkins et al. 2015. The contemporary era has seen the realignment of traditional cleavages along first and second dimension lines, leading to the emergence and success of smaller party families, including populist left and right parties. This process has been heavily shaped by both demand and supply side factors, rather than just changes in public opinion. Globalization and neoliberalism hypothesis. The transition to the neoliberal economic globalization model of the post-1980s era has contributed to rising levels of voter dissatisfaction with mainstream political representation. This model is characterized by large-scale privatizations, deregulation, austerity, and the increasing financialization of the economy. This has been accompanied by massive declines in union membership and the political power of organized labor, as well as the outsourcing of jobs from higher-income countries to lower-income countries. The neoliberal consensus adopted by mainstream left parties constitutes the so-called third way approach, which is an attempt to pair right-leaning economic policies of liberalization with left-leaning social policies. The third way approach is a third option between full social democracy and full neoliberalism, popularized in the 1990s by the Bill Clinton administration in the US. It is now characteristic of most mainstream parties in advanced industrialized democracies. Berintas and Powell 2004. The processes of economic globalization have been argued to create winners and losers with different sets of political attitudes and desires. The losers are those who are most negatively impacted by economic competition and are likely to support populist right parties. The winners are more educated, socio-cultural professionals who identify as middle to upper middle class and hold more cosmopolitan views and embrace diversity and are more likely to support mainstream parties. Increasingly, the winners have become the key constituency for mainstream parties both left and the right, while the losers are becoming increasingly disaffected with such parties and seeking alternatives such as populist parties. Changing nature of the media hypothesis. The rise of populism is linked to the changing nature of the media and its relationship with consumers. In previous eras, the media was more independent and dedicated to an objective presentation of news and facts. However, in the contemporary world, media companies have become increasingly tied to both state and corporate actors, hindering their ability to remain committed to objective reporting and increasing ideological biases in their reporting. This process has resulted in rising levels of dissatisfaction with the media and a desire for alternative sources of information and news among large swathes of the electorate. This has emboldened populist actors on both the left and right to legitimize their views and concerns that the major institutions of society have been captured by the elite. Additionally, an increasingly educated population can undermine confidence in the mainstream media, as a more educated voting base is likely to be informed about the issues that most influence them. The dissemination of populist ideas through different media channels and the rise of the fake news discourse has also provided populist actors with the opportunity to mobilize large numbers of voters around their causes and contribute to further polarization of society. Shocks crises hypothesis. Large-scale shocks have been hypothesized to influence the rise of populist actors in the political sphere. This hypothesis is based on the idea that during periods of extreme difficulty, individuals may become more susceptible to messages and political agendas that ascribe blame and outline plans to address them. Two recent key crises that have had a significant effect on the emergence of populist rhetoric and success have been the 2008 global financial crisis and the 2015 migration crisis in Europe. The 2008 global financial crisis was a disastrous economic shock which resulted in populist actors' parties gaining massive levels of support and achieving electoral breakthroughs in many countries worldwide. It also sparked a variety of populist movements such as the Occupy movement, which was highly anti-establishment in orientation and attributed the cause of the crisis to an increasingly predatory capitalist system. The 2015 migration crisis in Europe had a similar effect on rising levels of support for populist parties, though much more in favor of right-wing populist parties. Anti-immigrant attitudes and rhetoric by parties witnessed a substantial increase in several countries throughout the continent, who increasingly adopted restrictive immigration policies in response to the crisis. Shocks of migration refugees crises have tended to increase support for right-wing populist parties, with the proportion of countries with populist governments increasing over time. The nature of a given shock or transformative event is also likely to influence the nature of the populist backlash that may ensue. On one hand, it is easier for ethno-nationalist populists on the right to mobilize voters on socio-cultural cleavages when shocks come in the form of large-scale migration refugee crises, while on the other hand, it is easier for populists on the left to mobilize voters on economic cleavages when shocks come in the form of trade, finance, and foreign investment events. However, both processes can occur simultaneously. The rise of populism is not necessarily the presence of crisis itself, but the way it is interpreted and performed by political actors. Shocks crises are beneficial to populist parties as they tend to actively mediate the ways in which these events unfold and are perceived by the populace. This can act as windows of opportunity for political actors to exploit the worries and concerns of citizens and frame themselves as the most suited to addressing the crises being faced. Any questions, comments on the hypotheses on the rise of populism? Role of leadership is loose. The most important aspect of populist mobilization is the role of leadership. Leaders can mobilize masses of supporters and push through political reforms that may be radical in a given context. Populist leaders have traditionally been viewed as charismatic strongmen who are independent of any office and free from constraint. They have used tactics such as crafting an image of the leader as a person of action and rejecting expert advice, anti-intellectualism, a sense of urgency, need for large-scale change, atypical communication style, and direct appeals to interactions with the common man. Populist leaders play a crucial role in defining the voice of the people, which is dependent on two factors: separation from the elite and connection to the people. The idea that the leader is separate from the elite is fostered through the notion of their outsider status, and the connection to the people is linked to their claimed authenticity and argument as to why they are part of the pure people and not the elite. Populist leaders tend to present themselves as political novices and draw distinctions between themselves and career politicians. They are distinguished by three ways: outsiders, outsiders, and insiders. Outsiders have no genuine links to the elite and build their political careers from outside of mainstream politics, while insiders tend to be more successful in more fluid political systems. Insider populism is a type of populist leadership that comes from within the ranks of the political elite. Any questions, comments on the methods of mobilization used by populists and the role of leadership are welcome. Discursive style. Populism is a discursive style of politics rooted in the elite-people dichotomy. It is used by political actors who use similar linguistic cues to espouse their ideologies, regardless of their ideological leanings. The focus of this approach is on the use of language to persuade large numbers of people to support a populist cause, rather than the individual actor. Political strategy. The most common tactic of mobilization is using a charismatic leader who claims themselves to be the representative of the people and the personification of the general will. This tactic is characterized by a top-down strategy in which leaders gain support through their personal appeal and through their engagement with supporters. Ideology. Populism is an ideology that views the elite as a single homogeneous corrupt group who are working against the general will of the people for self-serving reasons. Law on populism. Ernesto Laclau's 2005 understanding of populism is that it is a multi-class movement rooted in claims of equality and political rights for a common people. It is accompanied by authoritarianism and or a charismatic leader, and two preconditions for its emergence are the formation of an internal antagonist and the emergence of a people with their own set of demands and plans to resist the antagonist. It also distinguishes between democratic demands which can be accommodated within an expanding hegemonic order. Laclau's concept of populism consists of three key elements: the articulation of a heterogeneous set of demands into a chain of equivalence, an empty signifier representing this chain of equivalence, and an antagonistic dividing line between the people on one side and those who would prevent them from fulfilling their demands on the other. The specific political nature and ways in which populism may manifest are dependent on the contexts in which they arise. Question 2. Evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of the major hypotheses that have been put forward to explain the rise of populism in the contemporary era. Which of these hypotheses do you find least convincing? The post-industrial